Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Legatum Institute and to this evening's lecture, which forms part of our lecture series in the year that's ahead of us, 2016, devoted to the history of capitalism and especially the history of the city within the story of capitalism. My name is Howell Williams, and as the senior advisor at this institute, I look after the Cultural Prosperity Programme, of which the History of Capitalism lecture course forms a part. There is a particular quality of hushed intensity and excitement at this institute this evening as we gather and anticipate what David Abulafia is going to be telling us about the Hanseatic League. Now, of course, fellows of the Legatum Institute are all enormously distinguished people. The glamour and the wonders of their works shine before us in the Empyrean, but none more so than David Abulafia, whose distinction as a historian of medieval Europe needs no really further advertisement for myself. His works from the 12th and 13th century onwards have shone light of a piercing intensity upon the evolution of medieval European civilization, and in a way that has always also, one rather feels, been able to illuminate certain features of the times in which we live. Who can forget, for example, those of you who are present, his wonderful lecture on proto-globalization, delivered as part of the History of Capitalism series last year. And those of you who, in the likely event of having been present and have forgotten any details of the lecture, can read all about it in the second volume of our lecture series, which has now been published on aspects of capitalism. Our story this evening is a story of Northern Europe. It extends across the North Sea to the Baltic Sea. King's Lynn plays a role in it, and also Lubeck and many cities along the Baltic. It's a story of what we now call Scandinavia, of eastern England, parts of northern France. It is a story of the Hansa, of the Hanseatic League, a federation, some might say, but certainly a league of individual merchants, individual towns that gathered in order to, over a process of some 3 centuries, to advance their common commercial interests. David has chosen to link this story with perhaps the origins of the first common market, and at a time when we are thinking about England's relationship to perhaps that rather wonderfully dated phrase itself, common market. That's a good phrase, and that's a good time in which to be thinking about these matters. But we're going to start this evening with Lubeck, which you can see in front of us here, that medieval Germanic town, and the story of one of my favorite German rulers, Heinrich der Löwe, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, who will now live with us in the words of David Abulafia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be back at the Legatum Institute. And I have to say that I'm doing something slightly mischievous, which is I've been writing a book, following on from my big history of the Mediterranean. I've been writing a history of the oceans. And so I need an audience that I can try bits of the new book out on. So that's you. And you can tell me whether you think that any of this really coheres. Because my history of the oceans has a very substantial section on the Atlantic before Columbus. And we tend to think of the Atlantic before Columbus as a non-sea, but in fact, as we look at the Baltic and the North Sea and these links which the Hanseatic merchants created all the way down to Portugal, we realize that there was actually a great deal going on in the Atlantic before 1492. Now, the title of the post I hold at Cambridge is Professor of Mediterranean History. And I sometimes explain to people that this isn't the same as being Professor of the History of the Mediterranean, because the concept of a Mediterranean, a Middle Sea, surrounded by land, is something that we can apply in other contexts as well. You can apply it to the South China Sea, you can apply it to the Caribbean, and in particular, some historians have tried to apply it, I think reasonably successfully, to the area that I'll be talking about, which is the Baltic and the North Sea together, thinking of that as a common area. And what bound the common area together, as we shall hear, is the activity of the Hanseatic League, over which the city of Lubeck presided as, in Latin, caput Hanse, the head of the Hansa. And this was very different in many ways to the Mediterranean way of commercial operation, which I talked about a bit in the very first lecture I gave at the Legatum Institute. And there we were thinking about people like the Venetians and the Genoese. Now, the Venetians and the Genoese, as some of you may know, constantly at each other's throats, great rivals. And then there were others who came in as well, the Pisans and the Catalans and so on. So even these Christian merchants who were trying to trade largely in Muslim lands, in the Greek Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and so on. Even these people were as much at war with one another as they were sometimes with Muslim enemies or Byzantine Greek enemies. And the area that I'm talking about today, the Mediterranean of the North, is rather different in character, because although there were certainly conflicts, tensions within the Hanseatic League, although there were conflicts also with certain forces that lay outside the Hanseatic League, the merchants of England, for instance, the merchants of some of the Dutch towns that didn't join the Hanseatic League, by and large, this was a collaborative framework in which people worked together. And from that point of view, the term common market is probably applicable. I'll be talking a bit more about the Hanseatic League as a model for the EU in a minute, model in inverted commas, I should say. So it's an organised space, Baltic and the North Sea, where mercantile activities were increasingly, I'll try and explain the process by which this happened, taken over by a loose confederation of towns. In fact, not even a confederation, it's a confederation of confederations. Lots of little groups of cities which then, by the middle of the 14th century, began to think of themselves as a sort of supergroup of cities, with, as we shall see, membership that was not often terribly well defined, except perhaps in the case of Lubeck, because Lubeck wanted to be the head of this network. It wasn't simply a confederation of maritime cities either. We tend to think of the Hansa. If any of you have ever travelled in the Baltic, you might have been to some of these places, Lubeck, Rostock, Visby. I mean, these are not places perhaps that British tourists tend to go to. They're very attractive cities by and large. But we think of the maritime cities, but in fact the majority of the cities in the Hanseatic League were inland German cities, places like Berlin, which in the Middle Ages was not a place of great importance, but it was keen to sort of get on the map, to build links to the richer cities along the coast. So the Hansa was also a means by which all the trade going on in this maritime space began to filter through into the German hinterland, and it was German. These were Germans, the Hanseatic merchants. I include under the heading of Germans, there were some Dutch, because the Dutch language in that period was a form of sort of Low German. My apologies to any Dutch people present. My wife is Dutch and she puts up with that comment occasionally. So, and the language actually that all these people spoke, Middle Low German, was sort of, as it were, halfway between Dutch and German. So these were German merchants, they were Christian merchants, although there were lots of Jewish merchants in the Rhineland. German Jewish merchants were very active in the wine trade. For some reason, they didn't get involved in any of this. All right, so what is a Hansa? Let's start with this word. The word Hansa was a general term for a group of soldiers, merchants, any group of people really could be a Hansa. But by the 14th century, it was being particularly applied actually by Scandinavian rulers as much as by Germans to this particular network which revolved around Lubeck, and also a subsidiary network, which I should mention, which revolved around Cologne. Because, as I said, there were also these inland cities, and to some extent Cologne was the capital of the inland network, being on the river and giving access to the North Sea. So in 1343, the King of Sweden and Norway addressed all the merchants of the Hansa of the Germans. And it's really from that point onwards that people begin to talk of this German Hansa. But they didn't call themselves that, by and large, among themselves, at least on formal occasions. Gradually, they began to use this term Jüdische Hansa, or Deutsche Hansa in modern German, German Hansa. But actually, what they wanted to call themselves was merchants of the Roman Empire. Now, this, of course, seems rather improbable, given that Lubeck in particular was in land which was conquered from the Slavs only in the 12th century. But this idea of Germany as the successor state to the ancient Roman Empire, through Charlemagne, through Otto the Great, the emperor in the 10th century, was a very powerful force. And it was something which wasn't quite as nonsensical as we tend to think, this claim of the German kings to be Holy Roman Emperors, which is the title that eventually got attached to them. Because actually there were parts of Germany, like Cologne, which were full of Roman monuments. Trier, if you've ever been to Trier, it's full of Roman monuments, which were very visible in this period as well. So they thought of themselves as both Romans and Germans. It's an interesting combination. And Lubeck had a particular status within all of that, because in 1226, the Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, one of the most famous of the medieval Holy Roman Emperors, he was also King of Sicily, he declared Lubeck a free imperial city, which meant that it could not be under the authority of anybody apart from the emperor. It's free to make its own laws, to govern itself. And this acted as a great spur to the expansion of the city. Well, that gives you some idea of the framework. But what I want to move on to next is a very fascinating issue, which is how the Hansa has actually been seen over the centuries, over the last century and a half, really. Now, some of these photographs are a bit fuzzy, and the reason for that is they were taken through glass cases, the glass cases of the new Hansa Museum, which only opened last year in Lubeck. And as far as I can tell, there still isn't a guide to the museum. It's a fantastic museum, but I had to take photos there for just, well, you can even see a reflection of me, actually, if you look there. I had to take photos through these glass cases. So they're not as good as they could be, particularly some of the maps. So the Hansa came very much to the attention of historians in the late 19th century in the context of German political developments. And one of the fascinating things about the historiography of the Hansa is how it has constantly matched significant developments in modern German history. So under Bismarck and the Kaiser, the period of the unification of Germany, what the Kaiser, particularly actually Wilhelm II, the time of the First World War, what he was looking for was evidence that Germany had in the past been a naval power. And this was somewhat hard to come by. And he was, of course, very anxious to build a fleet to compete against the British fleet. He was quite explicit about that. So they turn back to the German Hansa, and they conjure up this image of the Hansa, not so much really as a trading network, but as a group of brave German sailors who are masters of the North Sea and of the Baltic. Well, that was understandable perhaps, but what then happened in the 1930s was a considerable change of direction, because under the Nazis, the Hansa again became great heroes. And these are two books here and here. You can see two books which were published in the Nazi period. And what the Nazis were interested in was a different aspect of the Hansa, which I haven't really alluded to so far, which was the involvement of the Hansa in the conquest by Germans, and if you like, the ethnic cleansing of Eastern Europe, the creation of German towns all along the coast of the Baltic, all the way up to Estonia, Riga, Tallinn, places like that, and the clearing out of the Slav population. So they were seen as a key element in the conquest of what were to become German lands. And this was very much bound up with a wider movement, not so much a commercial movement, but a form of crusade. We tend to think of the Crusades, of course, very much in the context of the Holy Land in the 12th, 13th centuries. But what we're talking about here is crusades, the so-called Northern Crusades, which were directed against Slav peoples and the Baltic peoples and so on. And these crusades, which resulted in massive conquests by the Germans, very much involved the Hansa, because they managed to get supplied the Crusader armies with armour, with food, that sort of thing. So, all right, these were people who were heroes for the Nazis. After the war, the Hansa was reconsidered radically by the inhabitants, by the historians of what called itself the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. And for them, what was interesting was something totally different. That this was a group of cities, so it was a sort of community of bourgeois proto-capitalists. That was interesting. Many of the cities actually lay in the territory of East Germany. I've mentioned Rostock, that's perhaps the most important, but there were lots of others along the coast and in the interior. And then they also got very interested in the evidence, which is certainly there, that within these cities, sometimes proletarian groups of workers, artisans, people like that, became politically active. So you had a revolutionary class within the cities. And this fitted very well with the Marxist orientation of the German Democratic Republic. When the German Democratic Republic dissolved, none too soon, I may say, after 1990, the Hansa came to be seen as a model for regional integration, linking countries in a sort of common market. The Estonian Prime Minister, on the day that Estonia entered the European Union, said, "The European Union is a new Hansa." And some German economic historians have been talking about the Hansa as a very interesting model in the sense that Germany is clearly the dominant economy within at least the Eurozone, within the EU, and lo and behold, go back to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, here are German merchants again giving a lead in European economic affairs. So the sort of thing they point to is the fact that the commercial law of Lubeck became standard throughout the Hanseatic cities, as if one could draw a comparison with the idea of a sort of standardization of commercial practices, commercial law within the European Union nowadays. Well, this wasn't just a commercial power, as I've said, and this is something which the Kaiser's historians recognized. It was also a naval force which was clearing the waters. Here we see a map, again from the Hansa Museum, a map which shows some of the Hanseatic routes within the Baltic, and there's Lubeck right down the bottom on the left, and you can see how deeply these routes penetrated into Russia, in fact, as far as Novgorod. I'll come to that later. But this was also an area which historically had been plagued by pirates. And you all know who those pirates were. Of course, the Vikings played a very important role in the trade of this area. But the Vikings had that sort of mixed function. Some of them were traders and raiders, sometimes both at the same time. So we have, first of all, a network which developed in the Baltic. And then if we look at the North Sea, and indeed beyond the North Sea, even as far as Iceland, which is up there, top left, and you can just see a smudge at the top, which is Greenland. So we've also got routes which linked the furthest extremities of the Atlantic, known to people in the late Middle Ages, through Bergen in Norway, and then down again, you can see, leading down through the Sound, which separates Denmark from Sweden nowadays, leading down to Lubeck. So these two networks, you can see, covered an enormous physical space and even went all the way up the coast of Norway looking for fish. I'll be saying more about fish in a minute. So this network was a major source of supply for an enormous variety of products. But what I want to stress is the more modest products, because, again, talking previously about Mediterranean trade, talking about Indian Ocean trade, particularly last time I was talking very much about luxurious spices, pepper, and all that sort of thing. Today we're talking about a very different sort of trading framework, in which, of course, there are spices. But the major things that they bring wax from Russia. There was enormous demand for wax in medieval Europe because, of course, it was used to light candles in churches. And within churches, wax made from honeybees certainly took priority. The idea of using the sort of material that you use to make ordinary candles, which was tallow from animals, animal fat, that wasn't really regarded as suitable for certainly the higher class type of church. Furs from Russia, phenomenal quantities of furs being brought from Russia. Codfish, herrings, wool, wheat, these are humdrum articles which were brought in large quantities. So we're not looking at those small quantities of very high value commodities that we're looking at when we talk about the spice trade. We're looking at enormous, vast quantities, millions of herrings coming into Lubeck each year. But there were spices too. The spices tend to come through Bruges, which you can just see in the bottom centre. You'd find London, then just go across a little bit. Bruges, which was the great centre of Flemish trade and banking. It wasn't actually a Hanseatic city, but there was a Hanseatic base there, which I'll come back to. So they got the spices, and I may have mentioned this in my last lecture, actually, so forgive me if I did. But I have this sort of theory that, if you look at German cuisine, it's quite clear that from the late Middle Ages onwards, all to do with social changes that were taking place, demographic changes that were taking place, the consumption of meat became greatly enlarged. And of course, when we think about meat in a German context, we think of sausages. And when you think about sausages, you think about spices, because the whole point is the meat is preserved with the help of cloves and pepper and all sorts of things like that. And so it seems to me that actually all of this was of fundamental importance to the development of a very significant area of German cuisine. And in fact, if you go to Lubeck to this day, if we just go back to the famous gateway, some of you may recognize this if you've ever had Niederegger marzipan, the famous marzipan, which is produced in Lubeck, and the symbol of the company is that gateway. Now, that Niederegger marzipan only goes back to about 1800, but long before that, of course, enormous quantities of almonds were coming from the Mediterranean and were being processed in these cities. So there was a spice trade as well. Don't let me deny that. Well, there's some codfish. I'll come to the codfish in a minute. So the first problem really is to try and explain why the Germans were as successful as they were. Because, as I've said, up to about 1100, the Baltic and North Sea were dominated by the Vikings. Lubeck was, in fact, the leader in the creation of a great German trading network in the Middle Ages. It was the first German town on the Baltic. We think of it now as, it wasn't even in the German Democratic Republic. It's always been in West Germany. So we think of it now as sort of somewhere in the middle. But in the 12th century, this was the line dividing the German population and the Slav population. There was actually a previous Slav population that lived in the area, and Henry the Lion, about whom we heard in the introduction, he was effectively, he wasn't actually the only founder of Lubeck, but he was the man who really got it going as a city. And this is a plan of Lubeck around 1170. So in the very, very early days, this town surrounded pretty well by water with access to rivers, and it grew pretty rapidly. So by 1300, it's some way inland. You've got the rivers leading up to the Baltic. And by 1300, it had about 15,000 inhabitants, which for a medieval city in Northern Europe was quite sizable. Genoa in the same period would have had about 50,000, but the Mediterranean, we're dealing with a different scale of things. And the size would have been about 1.5 kilometres from top to bottom and 1 kilometre from side to side. So again, by medieval standards, that's quite a large city. Not as big as Bruges, which had a much larger population, about 36,000 by 1300, and was certainly, it's probably about a mile across, something like that. And in 1400, it looks as if Lubeck had 20,000 inhabitants. Now, why do I give you these figures? From 15,000 to 20,000 across the 14th century. Because in the middle of the 14th century, this whole area was completely hammered by the Black Death. And that wiped out in many cities at least half the population. So what we're saying is that by 1400, Lubeck had actually recovered from a demographic disaster, the coming of the plague, at a time when actually across Europe, recovery from the Black Death was relatively slow. And this was initiating a sort of golden age in the history of Lubeck. Lubeck looked several ways. Because it is positioned just on the right-hand side of Denmark, it had easy access, obviously, to the Baltic, no problem about that, all the way up to Russia, Novgorod in Russia, and so on. But it also looked across. There was a land route through Hamburg, which gave access to the North Sea, and later on the ships would sail through the Sound between Denmark and Sweden and would reach the North Sea that way. And it began to create a whole series of satellite towns across the North Sea, Rostock, Danzig, or Gdansk, perhaps the most famous of those towns, which became very important in trade with England in the 15th century. Lubeck was a handsome city. Here's a model of Lubeck, which at least it'll give you some idea of the sort of density of population, surrounded by walls, surrounded by water, as it would have been around 1400, with lots of magnificent churches. Here is the interior of one of them, and here's the exterior of another one. Brick, particularly this multicolored brick, was a sign of great sort of wealth and prestige. And this Lubeck style of building really became the norm across large areas of Northern Europe. Anywhere between Bruges and Tallinn in Estonia, that enormous coastline of the North Sea and the Baltic, you will find similar sorts of buildings. And the creation of what we could call a Hanseatic civilization, which had a common language, as I've said, Middle Low German, and also a common architecture, a common culture in many ways. Here are the salt stores in Lubeck, which date from the 16th century. Salt, as we shall see, was extremely important to the economy. Another modest sort of product which nonetheless really transformed the economy of this city and its neighbours. Now, Lubeck couldn't actually have achieved what it set out to do, becoming a major trading centre with privileges from Henry the Lion, with privileges from the Holy Roman Emperors and so on, without the cooperation of one or two neighbours. And the most important of these neighbours was a town called Visby, which lies on the island of Gotland, an island off the coast of Sweden, to the north of Lubeck. So an island completely separate from the rest of Scandinavia. And here's a merchant house in Visby, a typical Hanseatic type of storehouse. The merchants tended to store their goods in their own houses. In the Mediterranean, they tended to use big joint sort of warehouses where you'd have a little corner which you would use yourself. But these people were very individualistic in that sense. Store your own goods in your own house, and then on the floors above, so any of you who've been to Amsterdam, you'll be familiar with that, you know, even in the 17th, 18th century, they're building in a not totally dissimilar style. And these German merchants who turned up in Visby became, and here's a model of Visby with Hanseatic ships in the bay and so on. These German merchants became, in the 12th century, the key to the success not just of Visby itself, but of Lubeck as well. Because Visby was the crossing point in the middle of the Baltic, where merchants from Russia, merchants from Germany, merchants from Scandinavia, all converged. This is now the cathedral of Visby, but in fact, it was the Church of St. Mary of the Germans. And the German colony in Visby had special privileges from the Swedish king. First of all, they set up the corporation of German merchants visiting Visby. Right, that was the name of this corporation. And then by about 1200, a second corporation came into existence, the Corporation of German Merchants living in Visby. So there were the seasonal visitors, but there were also the permanent people. So Visby became a sort of Germantown, a sort of outpost of Lubeck. And with this amazing set of walls, which go on 3.5 kilometres of walls. It's, I think, the longest set of medieval walls to survive anywhere in Northern Europe. And these amazing ruined churches, the only church that's still functioning is the German church, now the cathedral. And these churches actually betray the influence of Russian styles of architecture. So this was the link to that exotic world which was bringing all the way from Russia furs and wax. So we can see that route again. You can see how there's Visby, and you can see the route which would take you up past Estonia, Reval as they've called it there, Tallinn as we know it, and then into the Russian hinterland by a river route which took you to Novgorod. Now, the link with Novgorod was extremely important. These Russian, the presence of the Hanseatics in Russia was expressed through a very distinctive institution known as the contour, or counter. And the contour was an enclosed area. Novgorod was not a member of this Hanseatic Confederation of Cities. It was ruled by a prince. It was a sort of republic, actually, in a way. The Prince of Novgorod allowed the German merchants to set up this enclosure within the city. And they would come in the winter and they would buy ermine. They would buy the white fur of the stoat, which was only available in the winter when the stoat changes its coat to a white fur. And that was, of course, very much in demand. I mean, you've all seen pictures of, well, you see it still if you watch film of the House of Lords, you know, people wearing their ermine capes and so on. And then they would go away and they would take their treasure chest with them back to Visby and come back in the summer when they would come and collect wax, because that was the time when the wax harvest was available. So this was an extremely profitable enterprise, and it was blessed by, here we are, here are some of the documents, privileges from the princes of Novgorod, that one in Russian, in favour of these German merchants. And this is a rather marvellous thing, a wooden carving of a Russian merchant from Lubeck, which shows he's got this long beard and this sort of Russian-style hat and so on. They were familiar with these people. These people turned up in Visby and the other Hanseatic cities, and the Hanseatics themselves, Lubeckers, went to visit them in their own home as well. Now, as the towns, as Lubeck and its neighbours grew, the demand for food became more urgent. And this was where the conquests, which were being achieved by these northern crusades along the coasts of the Baltic, became again more important, because the lands that were being conquered were given over increasingly to the production of rye, to produce that sort of black bread which one still finds in that part of Europe. And these goods, these humble goods, the rye and the salt and things, were carried on ships of this sort. This is a model of what we call a cog, an early type of cog, just a pretty humble trading ship, quite shallow draft, so it could go right up to the beach or even a little way into the rivers and so on. And here is a modern reconstruction of a cog sailing off the coast near Lubeck, actually. I mean, it's not a terribly clear picture because it was in the far distance, but I sort of enlarged it as much as I could. So this is the sort of ship, humble ships, which nonetheless were perfectly adapted to carrying vast quantities of bulky goods. And the most important, perhaps, of these goods at some point were herrings. So that's the sort of commodity we're dealing with. 1368, 250 ships full of herrings arrived in a single year in Lubeck. Now, I worked out that that is millions and millions of fish. And these fish were then distributed across not just Northern Europe. They weren't just consumed, obviously, in Lubeck, but they were being taken right down into the Mediterranean. Some of them would end up in Barcelona, places like that, particularly during the period of Lent, which has just begun, of course, because during that period, people were not supposed to eat meat, but herrings were the perfect substitute. The problem was that herrings deteriorate very rapidly after they have been fished out of the sea. And that's because it's a very oily fish. So if you leave them too long, you're going to get rancid herrings and you're going to poison yourself. So this is where, according to legend, actually, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but according to legend, a Dutchman called Willem Berkelzoon in the 14th century developed a new way of pickling herrings. And that is the way that we're left with to the present day. And Berkelsen has been rated by an official Dutch website as the 157th most important Dutchman because of his contribution to Dutch civilization. Well, whether or not he invented this, it was all to do with packing the herrings in salt the moment that they were landed on board the fishing vessels. And there was an enormous fair which took place not far from Lubeck on the Swedish shore, Scania, where these herrings and other things were traded. Said that when the herrings were spawning, if you walked into the water on the coast, I mean, you just couldn't walk, you couldn't get into the water for herrings. All around you, all around your feet, all around your legs, you just have herrings swarming around. It sounds a rather unpleasant experience. But in order to get the salt, of course, the Hanseatic merchants, the Lubeckers, had to look further afield. And here again, Lubeck was perfectly situated because I mentioned that they had quite a good trading arrangement with Hamburg, and close to Hamburg was Lüneburg Heath, famous for the end of the First World War. But Lüneburg Heath was a major source of salt. But eventually that salt began to run out. Actually, I showed you some of the salt warehouses. And they had to go further and further afield to the Bay of Bourgneuf in northern France, really a long distance away. And then as that began to give way, you even find them going all the way down to Portugal in search of salt. So this acted as a stimulus to enlarging their trade networks which extended then from Lisbon to Tallinn. As business grew, the Hanseatic cities under the leadership of Lubeck began to organise themselves much more formally, but still by the standards, let's say, of the European Union, extremely informally. There were regular diets, the so-called Hansetage, the Hanse days, which were sort of parliaments of cities, but actually not many cities bothered to turn up to these events, and the decisions were all made beforehand, largely by the Lubeckers. Most of these parliaments were actually held in Lubeck, 2/3 of them. So it was a way in which Lubeck was able to assert its supremacy within the Hanseatic League. There was no administrative superstructure, even though we can talk of about 200 towns which at some point or other were considered to be members of the Hanseatic League. But towns would sort of come and go, particularly those inland towns. They would enter into a sort of trading agreement to get tax concessions for trade and so on, and then rather disappear off the map. What they all did want to see done, and was done very effectively, was a major assault on piracy, which at the end of the 14th century became a major problem. It's all bound up with succession crises in Sweden and so on. And the Hanse actually proved itself at that point as an effective naval force. So historians have tended to argue that in the late 14th century, the Hanse transformed itself from what they've called the Hanse of merchants into the Hanse of towns. That is to say, the towns themselves sending their representatives, if they wanted to do so, to these diets, thinking of it in terms of a confederation of towns rather than an association of private merchants. And that seems to be a reasonable way of looking at it. Now, let's just turn then to the career of one or two Hanse merchants to give you some idea of what we're talking about. This is a merchant family called the Weckinghusen family. And the Weckinghusens in the 15th century traded all the way, they became citizens of Lubeck. They actually came from what's now Estonia, and they traded all the way to Venice, actually. And 500 documents concerning the Weckinghusens were found nearly a century ago in the archives in Estonia when somebody opened a box of pepper, a 15th century box full of pepper. And they sort of poked around in the pepper and they discovered underneath this great pile of documents. So the pepper was obviously one of the things that they dealt in. And what we learned from the Weckinghusens is that private trade was a risky business. One of them, Hildebrand, this is a letter from Hildebrand to his wife, he's the sort of man who takes a lot of risks, who gets himself in debt to Italian bankers and so on, who's constantly coming up with schemes to make more money. And his brother, a man called Sivert, keeps saying, oh, calm down, you know, there's a limit, don't take so many risks. But in the end, he finds himself arrested, sent to the debtor's prison for 3 or 4 years. The debtor's prison wasn't actually such a bad place if you had friends who brought you food every day, but you couldn't sort of go out and wander in the street. And what you get from the Weckenhusen documents is a sense of the fragility of these trading networks, even when one's looking at an exceptionally successful and prosperous family like this. These were people who traded in Russian furs, Flemish cloth. They would expect to make 15 to 20% profit on the sort of trade they were conducting. Now, that gives you some idea, perhaps, of what was happening. Oh, here's a map of the trading network of the Weckenhusen family, which you see was extremely extensive, going right down to Venice on the Adriatic. And another map from the Hansa Museum, so not the clearest image, I'm afraid. But there were other places in which the Hansa was extremely active, and one of them was the city of Bruges. Bruges was not, of course, it wasn't actually a member of the Hansa, but there was a house which you can still see, the house of the Easterlings, or the Hanseatic merchants. They had a house there, and then they sort of scattered around the city, living in private accommodation. And for them, Bruges was the great link, tying the Hansa to the outside world. It was the link that tied the Hansa to the Italian trade networks, bringing all those spices from the Mediterranean. So here are the regulations of the Hansa trading post in Bruges from the 15th century. And here is a list of Hansa merchants who were actually in Bruges in the 15th century. Another product which I've mentioned already, codfish. Back to the codfish. Why is codfish so important? Well, codfish is important in the context of what I was saying about herrings. You take cod out of the water, and because it has a very low fat content, all you need to do is you sort of open it up, hang it in the wind, and you have dried cod in all those different forms. I mean, if you go to Portugal nowadays, you have dried cod, salted cod, you have various types of cod. This cod, often fished off Greenland, Iceland, northern Norway, and just left for months and months and months in these cold North Norwegian winds to dry out, became another exceptionally important article of trade in which the Hanseatic merchants specialized. And the place where they did this was Lubeck's sort of colony at Bergen. Now, this is a sort of reconstruction. Bergen in Norway, in the North Sea. This is a sort of reconstruction of the inside of one of these rather grim dormitories in which people lived in Bergen. If you go to Bergen nowadays, also there's a very good Hansa museum there where they've reconstructed the inside of these dormitories. There was a Lubecker settlement there, which was isolated, it was in the middle of the town, but it was isolated from the rest of the town, surrounded by a fence, patrolled by Lubecker guards. And what was the reason for this? Well, they were always worried that the secrets of their trade might leak out. They were worried that young men would escape at night and go and visit the prostitutes in the city, this is what they said, and would give away the secrets of Lubecker trade. So young men who were apprentices were brought to the contour, and they had to undergo the most horrific initiation rituals before they were really accepted as, you know, beyond an apprentice, actually as full merchants. They were sort of put in the sea till they half drowned. They were roasted over open fires and things like this. But the point was, this created a sense of solidarity among the Hansa community. That was the purpose of doing this. To create a sense of community and keep them apart from the Norwegians among whom they lived. So you had to be a Hanseatic, a Lubecker first, and a temporary resident in Bergen second. Well, one could multiply the examples, but before I finish, I should say something about the role of London and also actually King's Lynn, because King's Lynn, although a very subordinate centre of Hanseatic trade, It's the only place in England where a Hanseatic building actually survives. It's now part of the sort of city council. It's a very humdrum building. But there is actually still, from circa 1500, a Hanseatic contour, a counter, which physically is still there if you poke around the side streets of King's Lynn. But the really important base in England, and England did matter to them, it was an important source of cloth in the late Middle Ages, it was an important source of wheat, was what was called the steel yard in London. Now, this term steel yard has nothing to do with steel. It probably means the court of the staple goods, Stapelhof, which became in English something like Steelyard, which lay under modern Cannon Street Station. And when Cannon Street Station was constructed in the late 19th century, everything of the Steelyard was swept away, so there's actually very little archaeological evidence. But what we do have is evidence in the National Archives for the degree of royal protection. The English monarchy understood the importance of having these merchants from Lubeck and also Cologne and Danzig and other cities in the heart of London, down by the Thames. They were taking out English wool, bringing vast quantities of German wine into London, and vast quantities of silver as well, German silver, which meant that during the Middle Ages, actually, England began to experience, at various points, quite rapid inflation because too much silver was coming into the economy. England actually had the purest coinage, I suppose, in the whole of medieval Europe. And this was the result of these massive sales of wool, not just to the Hanseatic merchants, but also to Flemish merchants and so on. And it created, well, we talk of sterling silver, 925 per mille. So this very, very high quality silver, which still exists in silversmiths' shops. The relationship with England was a slightly tricky one because it was constantly compromised by accusations of English piracy. But at the same time, there were very large numbers of English merchants, by about 1500, who were penetrating all the way into the Baltic. So they would have been familiar in Lubeck and even more in Danzig, further along the coast. Well, to conclude, as a result of the foundation of Lubeck, as a result of the initiatives taken by the merchants of Lubeck, by 1500, the entire space between England and the eastern Baltic was abuzz with trade. It truly was a Mediterranean of the north. But what had created this Mediterranean of the north, as I say, wasn't the sort of thing that we look at when we talk about the Mediterranean. It wasn't the availability of pepper and cloves and cinnamon and all these things. It was actually these humdrum products, back to the codfish, back to the herrings and rye and all that sort of apparently rather dull sort of product, but nonetheless the things which were vital to human existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.